There is a wooden crate in the basement of a regional archive in Central Europe, and inside that crate are roughly 400 glass plate negatives that no one has properly catalogued since the year they were sealed. Most of them show what you would expect from the 1870s, men in stiff collars standing beside boilers, factory yards full of mud, horses, chimneys, but 12 of those plates show something else. 12 of them show machines, large, complicated, deliberate machines, photographed with care, placed at the centre of the frame as if they mattered enough to be remembered. And when modern engineers are shown these 12 images, something strange happens. They go quiet, they lean in, they ask to see them again, and then they admit one after another that they do not know what they are looking at. These are not blurry pictures, these are not hoaxes printed last year and aged with coffee. These are documented exposures with grain consistent with wet collodion process, with the right kind of light, with the right kind of dust. The people who took them knew exactly what these... I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. They stood beside them, they oiled them, they depended on them, and in the span of a single human lifetime that knowledge was gone so completely that the most qualified people we have today cannot reconstruct it. The first photograph shows a hall. It is a long industrial hall with a glass roof, the kind built in dozens of cities in the middle of the 19th century. And running down the centre of that hall is a single machine, perhaps 60 feet long. It has no obvious boiler, it has no firebox that anyone has been able to point to. What it has is a series of polished copper spheres mounted along a horizontal spine, each sphere connected to the next by curved tubing, and at regular intervals along that spine are seats. Not seats for passengers, seats for operators facing inward toward the spheres. Modern engineers who study this image cannot agree on what the spheres contained, how they were charged, or what the operators were adjusting. The official archive label, written in faded ink, calls it a regulator. It does not say what it regulated. What makes this first image important is not the machine alone. It is the building around it, because that glass-roofed hall was, according to the city tax records of the period, a place of commerce. Goods moved through it, money moved through it. Whatever that long copper machine did, it was at the economic centre of a working city. And then both the machine and the industry it served disappeared from the ledgers within 2 decades, replaced by entries that simply read, coal. Consider what that substitution actually means. A ledger is not a story. It is a record of what a city paid for and what it earned, line by line, year by year, and it does not lie the way a memoir might lie. When the ledger of that city changes its language, when it stops describing whatever the long copper machine produced and begins describing fuel, freight and furnace labour instead, it is recording a real event. Something that used to generate value in that hall stopped doing so, and something cheaper, dirtier and far better documented took its place. The official history calls that progress. The revisionist history asks a sharper question. If the copper machine was already at the economic centre of the city, already working, already paid for, why was it worth replacing at all? Progress usually means doing more with less. This looks like the opposite. This looks like doing less with more, and then carefully forgetting that there had ever been another way. The second photograph is more intimate. It shows a workshop, and in that workshop is a device about the size of a grand piano. It is made of brass and a dark wood that has been turned on a lathe into hundreds of identical spindles. Those spindles are arranged in rings, ring inside ring, like the gears of a clock, but without teeth that touch. There is no visible power source. There is no belt running to a sealing shaft, which is how almost every other machine of the era was driven. The spindles simply stand there in their rings, and a man in an apron rests his hand on a lever at the side. Engineers looking at this photograph keep returning to one detail. The lever connects to nothing they can identify. It enters the body of the machine, and the photograph ends there, and no schematic of any comparable device has ever been found in any patent office in any country. The economic record around this second machine is even stranger than the first. The workshop belonged to a firm that, for 11 years, paid taxes at a rate suggesting enormous output. Then the firm dissolved, not bankrupted. dissolved with its assets unlisted, its inventory unrecorded, and its founders vanishing from every directory in the region. A profitable enterprise does not simply evaporate. And yet this one did, taking whatever those wooden rings produced with it. The third photograph shows the open air. It is a field, and in that field stands a tower of iron latticework, perhaps 90 feet tall. At the top of the tower is a horizontal ring, and from that ring hang cables that descend to a circular track on the ground. Along that track sit cars, but the cars have no wheels in the normal sense. They rest on the track by means of curved shoes, and the cables from the tower attach to the cars at a single point above their centre of mass. There is no engine on any car. There is no engine at the base of the tower. The thing is clearly meant to move. The cars are clearly meant to travel the circular track. And there is no identifiable mechanism that would make that happen. When we talk about revisionist economic history, this is precisely the kind of artifact that forces the conversation. Because conventional history tells us that in the 1870s motion required combustion or muscle or falling water, steam, horses, mills on rivers. That is the entire menu. And yet here is a documented installation, 90 feet of deliberate engineering that fits none of those categories, photographed by people who treated it as ordinary. Either our understanding of what powered the 19th century economy is incomplete, or a great many serious people went to enormous expense to build something that did nothing. Neither answer is comfortable. There is a third possibility, and it is the one that gives this whole subject its weight. Suppose the 19th century did have access to a form of motive power that did not depend on burning anything. And suppose that power was not magic, but simply a technology, a craft, a body of practical knowledge held by a relatively small number of firms and families. Technologies like that are fragile in a way that coal and steam are not. Coal is everywhere. Anyone can dig it, anyone can burn it, and the knowledge of how to use it spreads naturally because it cannot be contained. But a craft held by a few hands is different. It can be bought, it can be suppressed, it can be allowed to lapse when the people who hold it die without training successors. And crucially, it can lose an economic war to a cruder rival. Not because the cruder rival is better, but because the cruder rival is more profitable to the people who control the capital. Coal built empires of ownership, mines and railways and ports, vast structures that concentrated wealth. A machine that drew its power from the air or the ground or some property of matter we have forgotten would have concentrated nothing. It would have been, in the most literal sense, uncontrollable, and uncontrollable things do not survive in an economy organized around control. The fourth photograph takes us underground. It was taken with magnesium flash, which we can tell from the harsh shadows, and it shows a chamber cut into rock. In that chamber is a machine that resembles nothing so much as a pipe organ, except that the pipes are made of a translucent material, possibly glass, possibly something else, and they are arranged not for sound, but in a spiral that tightens toward the center of the room. At the heart of the spiral is a basin. The basin is empty in the photograph, but the staining on its interior suggests it once held a liquid, and channels in the floor lead away from it toward the edges of the frame. No mining record, no quarry record, no municipal water record accounts for this chamber. It exists in the photograph and nowhere in the paperwork. What troubles engineers about the fourth image is the precision of the spiral. The translucent pipes decrease in size according to a ratio that several observers have measured and found to be consistent, mathematical, intentional. This was not decoration. Someone designed this spiral to do a specific job involving the flow of something through narrowing channels into a central basin, and that job was important enough to justify cutting a chamber out of solid rock. We do not know what the job was. We only know it was worth the labor of dozens of men. The fifth photograph returns us to daylight and to something almost familiar. It shows a locomotive. But it is a locomotive without a coal tender, without a smokestack of any normal proportion, and with a body that is far too smooth, far too sealed, for a machine that was supposed to be venting combustion gases. Along its flank runs a row of circular ports, each covered by a hinged metal plate, and a crew of 4 stands beside it, looking directly into the camera with the calm pride of men who run an ordinary train. The track beneath it is standard gauge. The platform behind it is a normal platform. Everything about the scene says railway, except the engine itself, which says something we have no word for. Here the economic thread tightens. Railway companies of the 1870s kept meticulous records because railways were the great capital projects of the age, the places where fortunes were made and lost. Locomotives were numbered, registered, insured, and tracked across decades. And yet this particular engine, photographed at a real platform on a real line, appears in no rolling stock register that researchers have located. It ran. People stood beside it. And the most paperwork-heavy industry in the entire 19th century has no memory of it. This is the moment where those who first encounter this material either lean in or walk away, and it is worth being honest about why. The absence of a record is not the same as the presence of a secret. Records burn, archives flood, clerks make mistakes, and whole registers have been lost to nothing more sinister than a leaking roof. A careful historian is right to reach for those explanations first, and we should reach for them too. But there is a threshold at which ordinary loss stops being a satisfying answer. One missing locomotive is a clerical error, a missing industry is an accident. A missing layer of the entire economy appearing again and again across different cities, different firms, different decades, photographed by different people who did not know one another, begins to strain the theory of accident past its breaking point. At some point the pattern itself becomes the evidence, and the pattern here is consistent. Wherever one of these machines appears, the paper trail thins, frays, and disappears. The sixth photograph is a portrait of a single object on a table. The object is a sphere of polished metal, about the size of a man's head, and it is covered in raised symbols. The symbols are not letters of any known alphabet. They are not numbers. They are arranged in bands that circle the sphere, and where the bands meet there are small protruding studs, dozens of them, each slightly different. A hand enters the frame from the right, a finger resting on one of the studs as if about to press it. We do not know whose hand. We do not know what pressing the stud would do. We only know that someone considered this sphere important enough to photograph alone, against a plain backdrop, with the reverence usually reserved for a crown or a relic. This sixth image is the one that most often makes people uneasy because it is so clearly an interface. The studs are controls. The bands are information. This is an object designed to be operated by a human hand transmitting instructions to a machine, and it comes from a decade when the most advanced control system in common use was a lever and a valve. An economy that produces objects like this is not the economy described in our textbooks. It is a different economy, with different inputs, different outputs, and different machines, and almost nothing of it survives except in 12 photographs. The seventh photograph shows a factory floor from above, taken from a gallery or a catwalk. Below, dozens of identical machines are arranged in perfect rows. Each machine is a vertical cylinder, taller than the workers tending it, banded with rings of a darker metal and topped with a shallow dish. The workers move between the rows carrying not tools but small containers, which they empty into the dishes at the top of each cylinder. There are no belts, there is no central engine. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. Each cylinder appears to run on its own, fed by whatever the workers pour into those dishes, and producing whatever it produces in silence, in rows, by the dozen. The scale is what matters here. This is not one curiosity in a field. This is mass production. This is an industrial process operating at full commercial volume with a trained workforce, a purpose-built building, and a logistics chain bringing in whatever filled those containers. An operation like this employs hundreds, it feeds families, it anchors a local economy. And when it ended, all of those people had to do something else, and all of that knowledge had to go somewhere, and the official history of the region records none of it, as if a thriving industry was simply edited out of the past. And here we have to talk about how industries actually die, because the revisionist claim only makes sense if you understand the ordinary version first. When a real industry collapses, it leaves wreckage. It leaves bankrupt owners and unemployed workers who show up in census records doing new jobs. It leaves buildings that get repurposed, machines that get sold for scrap and turn up in someone else's inventory, court cases over unpaid debts, newspaper notices, pension disputes, the whole messy aftermath of economic failure. Death by competition is loud. Death by exhaustion is loud. Even death by natural disaster leaves a trail of insurance claims and relief funds. What does not happen, what essentially never happens in the normal course of economic history, is for a full-scale industrial operation to simply stop and leave nothing behind. No scrap, no repurposed building, no workers tracked into new trades, no litigation. The cylinders in their perfect rows did not get sold off one by one to other factories, because if they had, we would have records of the sale and we would have the cylinders. They are not in any museum, they are not in any private collection, they are in one photograph and then they are nowhere. And that kind of clean disappearance is not how the economy normally forgets. The 8th photograph is damaged. A third of the plate is fogged, ruined by light or age, but what remains shows the edge of a structure that defies easy description. It is curved, like the hull of a ship, but it is studded with the same circular ports we saw on the 5th machine, the impossible locomotive. Resting against the structure is a ladder, and a man stands on the ladder reaching up toward one of the ports, and the scale of him against the curve tells us this thing was enormous, larger than a house, larger than most buildings of its day. What it was, whether it moved, whether it floated or rolled or simply sat, we cannot say, because the part of the photograph that would answer those questions is gone. It is worth pausing on the damage itself. Of the 12 photographs, this is the only one significantly ruined, and it is ruined in exactly the place that would have shown us the most. That may be coincidence. Glass plates fog, light leaks in. But in a collection where every other plate survived intact, the loss of precisely this information has a way of feeling less like accident and more like editing. And the people who study these images do not all believe in coincidence. The 9th photograph shows a room full of cabinets. The cabinets are made of wood and glass, and behind the glass are arrangements of wire coiled and looped and connected to small jars. To a modern eye, this looks almost like early electrical equipment, and that is the trap, because the moment you assume electricity, you start to explain the photograph, and the explanation falls apart under examination. The coils are wound in patterns that serve no electrical purpose anyone can name. The jars contain no plates, no acid residue, nothing that matches a battery. The wires connect the cabinets to one another in a network, but the network has no obvious source and no obvious load. It is a system. We simply cannot say what the system did. The economic implication of the 9th image is the most provocative of all. A room like this, full of connected cabinets, full of a working network of wire and jar and coil, represents infrastructure. It is the kind of thing a city builds or a company builds to do something continuously day after day, the way we build power stations or telephone exchanges. Infrastructure is expensive. Infrastructure is permanent. People do not build it and then forget it, and yet here is infrastructure, photographed and real, that has left no trace in any utility record, any company history, or any municipal plan. An entire layer of how that society functioned has simply gone missing. Think about what infrastructure represents in an economy. It is the part you stop seeing precisely because it works so well. We do not marvel at the pipes that bring water to our homes or the cables that carry power into our walls, because they are simply there, reliable, invisible, the silent foundation everything else stands on. That invisibility is earned over decades of dependable service. So when we look at a room full of connected cabinets that hum along as quiet, trusted infrastructure, we are not looking at an experiment. We are looking at something mature, something that has already proven itself, something a society has decided it can rely on without a second thought. And that tells us this network was not new in the 1870s. It had a history behind it, a development, an adoption, a long settling into the background of daily life. There should be decades of records leading up to this photograph and decades leading away from it. Instead, the photograph stands alone, a single frozen instant of a mature system with no past we can trace and no future we can follow, like finding the keystone of an arch with no arch around it. The 10th photograph is almost beautiful. It shows a courtyard, and in the courtyard is a fountain, except it is not a fountain. Water rises from a central column, but it does not fall back in the usual way. Instead it forms shapes, sustained shapes, arcs and rings that hold their form in the air in a manner that water photographed in 1870 should not be able to do, given the exposure times of the period. The people in the courtyard are not looking at the fountain. They are walking right past it, going about their daily routine, treating a thing we cannot explain as part of the ordinary furniture of their lives. That casualness is the recurring theme, and it is the heart of the revisionist argument. In every one of these photographs, the extraordinary machine is treated as ordinary by the people around it. No one gawks, no one points. The impossible locomotive has a proud but unremarkable crew. The spiral chamber has its quiet operators. The courtyard fountain has indifferent passers-by. These were not wonders to the people who lived among them. They were tools. They were normal. And a thing can only become normal in a society that has lived with it long enough to stop noticing, which means these machines were not flashes of genius, but established, integrated, everyday technology. The 11th photograph brings us back to a single inventor, or at least to a single man. He sits in a chair beside a device that rises from the floor to well above his head. The device is a column of stacked rings, each ring slightly offset from the one below, so that the whole forms a gentle spiral as it climbs. At the top is a crystalline element catching the light. The man is elderly, dignified, and he rests one hand on the lowest ring with the easy familiarity of ownership. On the table beside him are papers too blurred to read, and a model of the same device in miniature. Whoever he was, he built this, he understood it, he posed with it the way a man poses with his life's work. And here is the cruelty of the economic record. We have the photograph of the man, we have his device, we can see his papers on the table, the very documents that would explain everything. But the papers are blurred, the man is unnamed in the archive, and no patent, no publication, no will, no estate inventory connects any individual to this machine. A lifetime of work, a fortune of effort, an achievement worth a formal portrait, and it produced no heir, no record, no continuation. The knowledge died with the man in the chair, and the economy that might have been built on his device was never built, or was built and then erased. The 12th and final photograph is the simplest and the most disturbing. It shows a wall. On the wall hang 12 framed photographs. And those 12 photographs are these 12 photographs, the very collection we have been discussing, displayed together in what appears to be a private study or a small museum, sometime not long after they were taken. Someone, very early, understood that these images belonged together. Someone collected them, framed them, hung them on a wall, and stood far enough back to photograph the whole arrangement. That person knew. That person had assembled the evidence and was preserving it deliberately. And then that person, and that wall, and that study vanished as thoroughly as everything else, leaving only this final image of an early attempt to remember what was already being forgotten. So we are left with the question we began with. How does an entire category of working machinery disappear from human memory in the span of 50 years? The conventional answer is that it never existed, that these photographs are misunderstood, that the copper spheres were boilers we fail to recognize, and the spiral chamber was a wine cellar, and the impossible locomotive was an ordinary engine seen from a flattering angle. Perhaps. People do misread old images. Context does get lost. The simplest explanation is usually the true one, and the simplest explanation is that we are looking at familiar things and failing to see them clearly. But the revisionist account asks us to weigh the evidence differently. It asks why the economic records fall silent at exactly the points where these machines appear. It asks why profitable firms dissolved without a trace, why infrastructure left no footprint, why the most documentation-heavy industry of the age forgot one of its own engines. It asks why the only damaged plate is damaged precisely where it would tell us the most. None of these questions proves anything on its own. A dissolved company is just a dissolved company. A missing register is just sloppy bookkeeping. But 12 of them stacked together, photographed together, begin to feel less like a series of accidents and more like the shape of something that was removed. We are not going to tell you what to believe tonight. We are going to leave you with the photographs and the silence in the records, and let you sit with the gap between them. Because whatever happened in those decades, whether it was the slow loss that always follows, then when an old technology is replaced by a cheaper one, or something more deliberate, the result is the same. There are machines in these 12 frames that no modern engineer can identify. There were people who built them, ran them, depended on them, and photographed them with pride. And in a single human lifetime, all of that knowledge slipped beneath the surface of history and did not come back up. There is one more thing worth saying before we leave the crate in its basement. The reason this matters is not really about copper spheres or spiral chambers or impossible locomotives. It is about how confident we are that we understand our own past. We tend to imagine history as a steady climb, each generation knowing a little more than the last, technology advancing in a straight line from the simple to the complex, from the weak to the strong. That story is comforting because it puts us at the top, the inheritors of everything that came before, the most knowledgeable people who have ever lived. But the photographs in that crate suggest a different shape to history, one that does not climb but rises and falls, gains and loses, remembers and forgets. The people in the stiff collars tended their fire. They built it into halls and towers and quiet humming rooms. And somewhere in the decades that followed, the tending stopped, and the fire went out, and we were born into the cold afterward, never knowing how warm that world had been. Whether you believe these machines were exactly what they appear to be, or whether you believe they are ordinary things we have simply learned to misread, the lesson at the bottom of the crate is the same. What one generation knows, the next can lose. What is ordinary today can become unidentifiable within a single lifetime. And the only defense against that kind of forgetting is to keep looking, keep asking, keep refusing to accept the silence in the records as if silence were the same thing as proof that nothing was ever there. Look at the photographs again. Look at the calm faces of the people standing beside the impossible. They are not posing with miracles. They are posing with the ordinary machinery of a world we have lost, a world whose economy ran on principles we have either forgotten or were never permitted to keep. The crate is still in the basement, the plates are still in the crate, and the men in the stiff collars are still standing beside their machines, waiting for someone to recognize what they already knew.